Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hadith 239. The narration from Al-Bara' ibn Azib. He says, I observed the prayer of the Prophet, and I found his qiyam, meaning his standing, and his ruku', and his standing after the ruku', and his sajda, and his sitting in between the sajda, and then his second sajda, and his sitting in between the taslim and the insiraf, meaning the period of time between the taslim and when you leave the masjid. He says, I found all of these to be proportionately the same length. So the meaning of this hadith is that if the Prophet would lengthen one part of this salah, then all the other parts of the salah would be proportionately lengthened. It does not mean to say that every action of the salah is of equal length. Clearly that's not possible, because the sitting in between the sajdatain cannot be as long as when you stand up to recite the Fatiha and the surah, obviously. Likewise, when you stand up after the ruku', this standing is not a very long standing, but the meaning of the hadith is that if one state of the salah is long, let's say the ruku', then all other states should be proportionately longer. And so if you make one state of the salah short, then all the others are proportionately shorter. So it shouldn't be the case that you make your ruku' extremely long, but your sujood extremely short, because this is disproportionate. Rather, you make them both long proportionately or both short proportionately. And that's the salah of the Prophet. And not just within the salah, also we find the insiraf. So this is after you make the taslim until you leave the masjid. So in other words, the adhkar after the salah. So if the salah is long, the adhkar after the salah are also proportionately longer. We also take from this hadith, look how carefully this Sahabi, Al-Bara' ibn Azib, is observing the Prophet's prayer, such that he noticed even these subtle differences. And this shows how interested the Sahaba were in learning about the Salah of the Prophet and all the other aspects of the Sunnah as well, not just the Salah. And we could contrast them to the Muslims nowadays. They're simply not interested in learning about the deen. They are mainly interested in making their money. Also a narration in the same chapter, Anas bin Malik said to his companions, I will not neglect to pray just as the Prophet prayed. And then one of his companions says that I saw Anas bin Malik do things which I have not seen anyone else do. He says that when Anas raised himself from the ruku', he stood standing until we thought that he has forgotten to go into the sajda. And he also says that when he raised his head from the sajda to sit in between the sajda, we thought that he has forgotten to make the second sajda. That's how long his sitting was. And this narration is extremely important because nowadays we find the Muslims have forgotten this. The standing up position after the ruku', they abuse this. They do not stand up for a decent amount of time. They hurry it. And especially the sitting in between the two sajdas, many people abuse this. They just make it about half a second long. Absolutely no tum'anina in it whatsoever. And this is contrary to the sunnah, but also you are losing out on the rukn of the prayer, which is tum'anina, which is that you have to be tranquil and still in your positions in the salah. And you must never hurry any position. And this sitting position in between the sajda, this is abused by so many Muslims nowadays. And we need to educate the Muslim masses that this sitting in between the two sajdatain, it is itself a rukn, and also the tum'anina is a rukn. So you must sit at least to the amount of time it takes to say Rabbi ghfirli. And we also know that to say Rabbi ghfirli at least once in that position is wajib. And many people don't know this and they abuse this position, so education is absolutely key. Hadith 240. From Al-Bara', he says that when the Prophet would say Sami Allahu liman hamida, that's when he raises from the ruku', of course, he says that one of us, meaning the companions, would not bend his back to go into the sajda until the Prophet went into the sajda position, and then we would enter the sajda position. So from this we learn that the companions would go into the sajda when the Prophet has placed his forehead in the sajda. And so likewise with all the other arkan of the prayer, you do it immediately after the imam does it. If you can see the imam, then you only go into the position after he does. If you cannot see the imam, then you move into the position after he finishes saying Allahu Akbar, which is the takbiratul intiqal. So you follow the imam, you do not go into the position at the same time as the imam. And also a problem which you find with many a'imma nowadays is that when they say the Allahu Akbar, which is the takbiratul intiqal, moving from one position to the other, they often stretch it out a bit. So they would say something like Allahu Akbar, and this is stretching it out. Rather we know that the sunnah is just to say it at normal pace. So you never stretch out the takbiratul intiqal. You just say it briskly. Likewise, when you make the taslim, many a'imma, they stretch it out. They say, Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullah. This is far too stretched out. Rather, you should just say it briskly.
Now one might ask, why did he take so long in the standing position after the ruku'? And the answer is that there are adhkar which can be said after the ruku', which you will find in any good dua book, and we recommend that you memorize some of these adhkar. And this will enrich your salah, as opposed to it being bare bones.
Hadith 241 from Ibn Abbas, he says that when the Prophet would raise his head from the ruku', he would say, Allahumma rabbana lakal hamd, ملء السماوات وملء الأرض وما بينهما وملء ما شئت من شيء بعد أهل الثناء والمجد لا مانع لما أعطيت ولا معطي لما منعت ولا ينفع ذا الجد منك الجد. You would say, O Allah, our Lord, and for you are the praises, meaning the hamd. And hamd is when you describe someone with qualities of perfection with love and veneration. To the fill of the heavens and the earth, meaning this is how much hamd he has, and everything in between the heavens and the earth, and the fill of everything after the heavens and the earth, meaning to say there is other creation beyond the heavens and the earth which we can see. So beyond the universe there is yet more creation. So the hamd belongs to Allah even to the fill of all those other creations that exist, which of course we don't know of. Ahl al-thana'i wal-majd, that Allah is worthy of thana or praise, or we could say excessive praise, and majd, which is a high honor and status. La mani'a lima a'tayt, there is no one who can prevent what you give, O Allah. Wa la mu'tiya lima mana'at, and whatever you have prevented, then no one can give it. So for example, if Allah grants you mercy, no one can prevent this mercy, and guidance and rizq and so on. But if Allah prevents you from some sort of rizq, then no one can give you this rizq, or guidance, or mercy, or whatever it may be. Similar to how we hear that whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. So if Allah grants him guidance, none can prevent this guidance. And whomsoever Allah misguides, none can guide. So if Allah prevents this guidance from someone, then none can give this guidance to that person. Al-Jad means when somebody has much richness and honor and status, and also authority. So if a person has all of this, then all of this richness, wealth, status, honor, authority, all of this cannot avail this person against Allah. وَلَا يَنْفَعُ ذَا الْجَدِّ مِنْكَ الْجَدِّ. So we find that the only thing which can avail you are your righteous actions. And so we find this is a dhikr which should be made after getting up from the ruku'. Of course, the minimum to be said is رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدِ, or any of its variations. But if you want to add on top of that this dhikr, then that is better. Hadith 242 from Ibn Abbas, he says the Prophet removed the curtain to go out and the people were standing in rows behind Abu Bakr, and the Prophet said, يا أيها الناس إنه لم يبقى من مبشرات النبوة إلا الرؤيا الصالحة يراها المسلم أو ترى له ألا وإني نهيت أن أقرأ القرآن راكعا أو ساجدا فأما الركوع فعظموا فيه الرب عز وجل وأما السجود فاجتهدوا في الدعاء فقمن أن يستجاب لكم. He said, O people, nothing from the good news of prophethood remains except a righteous or a true dream which a Muslim sees or is seen for him by another person. Behold, I have been forbidden from reciting the Quran in the position of the ruku' and the sujood. So as for the ruku', then make ta'zeem of the Lord Azza wa Jal, and as for the sujood, then strive in making dua, because it is more worthy to be accepted in that position. So firstly, we find the Prophet is saying that there is no more prophethood remaining. Of course, the Prophet is the last Prophet, there will be no more prophethood after him, but the closest thing to prophethood, meaning Allah Jalla wa Ala inspiring you with something, would be a true dream which a Muslim sees or is seen for him. Because this resembles prophethood. It's not prophethood exactly, but it resembles it, in that Allah Jalla wa Ala is giving you some information and inspiration. And the Prophet ﷺ did say that a true dream is 1 out of 46 of prophethood. So it's a part of prophethood. It's not exactly prophethood, but it does resemble it. because it is a type of wahi or inspiration. Wahi in the Arabic language means to inform someone quickly and secretly. So is the adhan a wahi? No, quite the opposite, because you're informing people of the salah, but it's not quickly, it's slowly, and it's not secretly either, rather it is quite publicly. So the Prophet says that a true dream is from the prophethood, and the Prophet ﷺ also said, أَصْدَقُكُمْ حَدِيثًا أَصْدَقُكُمْ رُؤْيًا. The truest of you in his speech will also be the truest in his dream. So if you want to have true dreams, then be truthful. And this is jaza'un wifaqa, a fitting reward. As for the ruku' and the sujood, the Prophet ﷺ says, make ta'zeem of your Lord. Yes, we know from the narration of Hudhayfa, when he prayed the nighttime prayer with the Prophet, he says the Prophet would say in his ruku', Subhana Rabbi al-Azim. And so to say this once in your ruku' is wajib. Anything more than that is sunnah. And as for the sujood, then Hudhayfa says that the Prophet would recite Subhana Rabbi al-A'la. And once is wajib, anything more than that is sunnah. But also you should make dua in your sajda as well, because you are closest to your Lord in the sajda. And so it makes sense that your dua is most likely to be accepted there. Some scholars have said that if you recite the Quran in the ruku' and the sujood, your prayer is batila, because you've done something specifically prohibited in the prayer. A bit like you eating and drinking during the fasting, that's specifically prohibited in the act of worship. And so they say the same thing here. Most scholars say, no, it doesn't break the prayer, but the reason why it is prohibited is because ruku' and sujood are lowly positions, and it is not fitting for the Quran to be recited in this lowly position. Otherwise, the actual recitation of the Quran is from the original part of the prayer, because we know that in the Salah you do recite the Quran. So reciting the Quran in the Salah is not anything new or something which does not belong to the Salah. Rather, it does belong to the Salah. What about in the sajda if you want to make dua, but your dua is also an ayah of the Quran? For example, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا وَهَبْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْوَهَّابُ. This is a dua, but also an ayah from the Quran. We say that this is permissible to be said in the sajda as long as your intention is to make a dua, not to recite the Quran, because your actions are judged by your intention. Also in the same chapter, Ali radiallahu anh says that the Prophet forbade him from reciting the Quran in the ruku' and the sujood position. And that just is further corroborating evidence to what we have been speaking about.
As for the dhikr of the ruku', then it is Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, and this is where the Prophet said about the ayah, فَسَبِّحْ بِسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ اجْعَلُوهَا فِي رُكُوعِكُمْ. Put it in your ruku'. And likewise Allah saying, سَبِّحْ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى. The Prophet said, اجْعَلُوهَا فِي سُجُودِكُمْ. Put it in your sujood. So you say, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la. And this is wajib to be said at least once, and this is the weightier opinion. As for the upper limit, then there is no upper limit, but one narration in the Sunan says that when Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahimahullah was praying the Salah, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu said, I have not seen a person more closely resembling the Salah of the Prophet than him, meaning Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And they estimated how long his sajda was, and they counted it to be about 10 tasbihat. And this is the ruku' and the sujood.
Hadith 243. What is to be said in the ruku' and the sujood? From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, أَقْرَبُ مَا يَكُونُ الْعَبْدُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ وَهُوَ سَاجِدٌ فَأَكْثِرُوا الدُّعَاءَ. The closest a servant is to his Lord is when he is in the sajda position, so make more dua. And this agrees with the previous hadith, that you are closest to your Lord there, so make dua more, as much as you can, because it is more likely that it will be accepted in the sajda position. From Abu Hurairah in the same chapter, he says that the Prophet would make this dua in his sajda, Allahumma ghafir li dhanbi kullihi diqqahu wa jillah wa awwalahu wa akhirahu wa alaniyatahu wa sirrah. O Allah, forgive all my sins, the ones I've committed a few times and the ones I've committed many times, the first of them and the last of them, and the ones I've committed openly and the ones I've committed secretly. So in this dua we find that he's asking for all of his sins to be forgiven, but then he goes into detail. The ones I've committed a few times and the ones I've committed many times, the first of them and the last of them, the ones done in open and in secret. He goes into detail. He could have just said, Oh Allah, forgive all of my sins. So why would he go into detail? when simply just one sentence would do? Well, the answer is a dua is you and Allah in a private consultation, and so it is worthy to extend out this dua, to lengthen your private consultation with Allah Jalla wa Ala, and to lengthen out this act of ibadah. And it also shows that you're desperate for Allah Jalla wa Ala to give you what you desire, because it's like you're beseeching Him. And in the same chapter from Aisha, she says that the Prophet would say much in his ruku' and his sujood, Subhanaka Allahumma Rabbana wa bihamdik, Allahumma ghafir li. He would make ta'weel of the Quran. And this is in response to Surah An-Nasr, when Allah orders the Prophet, فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ. Make subhan of your Lord and praise Him and seek forgiveness for your sins. So this is exactly what the Prophet would do after that surah in his ruku' and his sujood. So yet again, this is a legislated dhikr in your ruku' and your sujood. The dhikr before this is to be said in the sujood, as the narration tells us. And also from the same chapter, Aisha says that one night she was looking for the Prophet because it was dark in the room, and she says her hand fell on both of the Prophet's feet as they were up erected when he was in the sajda, and the Prophet was reciting, Allahumma a'udhu biridaka min sakhatik wa bimu'afatika min uqubatik wa a'udhu bika mink la uhsi thana'an alayk anta kama athnayta ala nafsik. O Allah, I seek refuge in your pleasure from your anger and in your forgiveness from your punishment, and I seek refuge in you from you. I cannot completely enumerate all the praises which belong to you. You are as you have praised your own self. Some scholars have used this hadith to say that if a woman touches you, then your wudu is not broken. Well, the correct opinion on this issue is that touching a woman or a woman touching you does not break the wudu. As for when Allah says, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, or you have touched women, then this is talking about sexual intercourse as explained in the tafsir by Abdullah ibn Abbas. But we find from this narration, when you're in the sajda, your feet are up erected and they are together, because Aisha's hand fell on both of the Prophet's feet, which would then suggest to us that your feet would have to be together. It needs to be noted from this dua, which you make in the sajda and anywhere else for that matter, it's just a normal dua, that you are not seeking refuge in the pleasure of Allah, nor in the forgiveness of Allah, because the pleasure of Allah and the forgiveness of Allah are attributes of Allah, and they are not the same as Allah Himself. And so you seek refuge in Allah, not in His attributes. But then how would we explain this hadith and this dua? Well, we say this is tawassul. You are using the attributes of Allah to make tawassul, and this is permissible. So in this hadith then, you're using the attribute of Allah, which is His rida, His pleasure, to make tawassul to Allah, to seek refuge from His anger. And likewise, you're seeking refuge from the punishment of Allah and making tawassul to Allah using His attribute of forgiveness. In the same way, somebody would say, Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum bi rahmatika astaghith. O Hayy, O Qayyum, the one who is living, the one who exists by himself and makes other things exist. Bi rahmatika, with your mercy, astaghith, I seek help. So you're not seeking help from the mercy of Allah. That would be shirk. You have to seek help in Allah, not in the mercy of Allah. But the rahmah, the mercy here, is being used as tawassul to Allah, meaning you use the names and attributes of Allah to seek closeness to Allah in your dua. So you call upon Allah using His beautiful names and also His beautiful attributes which He has. Also in the same chapter, from Aisha, she says that the Prophet would recite in his ruku' and his sujood, Subbuhun Quddusun Rabbul Malaikati wa Ruh. So Subbuh is the one who is Musabbah, so the one who is free and raised from all defects, and Quddus is the Mutahhar, the one who is purified. So Allah is pure from any defect and negative attributes and actions. Rabbul Malaikati wa Ruh, so that's the angels, and the Ruh is Jibreel alayhi salam. So this is yet another dhikr which we can make mention in the ruku' and the sujood. Hadith 244, from Thawban, the freed servant of the Prophet, that the Prophet said, عليك بكثرة السجود فإنك لا تسجد سجدة إلا رفعك الله بها درجة وحط عنك بها خطيئة. Upon you is to make much sujood, because for every sajda you take, Allah will raise you one grade and remove one sin from you. And in the same chapter, from Rabi'at ibn Ka'ab al-Aslami, he says that the Prophet asked him, ask me whatever you want to. And he says, I want to be with you in Jannah. And the Prophet said, أو غير ذلك, or perhaps you want something other than that. And he said, no, هو ذاك, I just want that. And the Prophet replied, فأعني على نفسك بكثرة السجود. Then help me to help you by making much sujood. So in both of these narrations we find making more sujood is virtuous, because you are moved up one grade in Jannah and one sin is forgiven from you. Not only that, but if you regularly perform many sujood, then you will be close to the Prophet in Jannah. And so both of these narrations then prove that you must pray nawafil actions to attain these virtues. So this could be the Salat al-Duha, the Salat al-Tahajjud, and of course the Rawatib Sunan. And between every adhan and iqamah there is 2 rak'at to be prayed. So adorn your acts of worship and your salah by performing nawafil acts of salah. What this hadith is not meant to prove is that you just make sujood independently. No, you don't do that. This would just be closer to bid'ah than a sunnah. Rather, when he says sujood, he means the salah, because that's the only place you make a sajda. You don't do acts of worship by just performing independent sajadat. Also from this narration we can take the virtue or the fadila of Rabi'ah ibn Ka'ab, in that when he was asked by the Prophet to ask him anything, he chose the best possible option. Otherwise he could have chosen much wealth from this world and many other materialistic things, but you can see that his level of thinking was far higher and beyond the ephemeral materialistic world that we live in. Hadith number 245, from Ibn Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ said, أمرت أن أسجد على 7 أعظم وأشار بيده على أنفه واليدين والرجلين وأطراف القدمين ولا نكفة الثياب ولا الشعر. The Prophet said, I have been ordered to prostrate on 7 bones, on the forehead, and he pointed towards his nose, and then on both hands and on both legs, meaning the knees, and on both the balls of the feet, and that we should not roll up the clothing nor the hair, meaning tie up the hair. So from this narration we learn that you prostrate on these 7 bones. The forehead and the nose is in following the forehead. So because of this, some ulama said that if you prostrated on the forehead but the nose was not touching, then your prostration is still correct, because the forehead is the main bone, not the nose. But nevertheless we say that both the forehead and the nose should be touching during your sajda. And then we have the 2 palms of your hands, they must both be on the floor. Then we have the 2 knees, they must be on the floor. And the 2 balls of the feet, they must be on the floor. If you complete your sajda with one of these bones not touching the floor, so in other words, you went the whole sajda with one of these bones not touching the floor, then we say your sajda is invalid and it must be repeated. So in this hadith we learn of the 7 bones of prostration. Making a prostration, meaning putting your forehead on your hands, and remember your hands are one of the bones of the prostration, so making a prostration on your hands, so the forehead on your hands, this would render your sajda invalid, because it's a type of cheating. Rather, the forehead needs to be on the floor and the hands need to be on the floor separately. What about if you prostrate on an item of clothing? Well, we say that if this item of clothing, let's say a mat or just any clothing, is not on you, so you're not wearing this clothing, then this is fine. You can prostrate on this. So for example, you could take off your jacket and use it as a prayer mat. However, if this item of clothing is something you're wearing, for example your amama, and you bring the tail of the amama in front and you prostrate on this, then this item of clothing you are wearing and you're prostrating on it,
and the majority of the scholars say that this is permissible, and there does not appear to be anything authentic to say it is haram or makruh.
You should avoid how the Shia pray. They put a little piece of cloth just on the prostration place, meaning the forehead place, and so the Ahlul Sunnah should avoid this, and they don't want to imitate the misguidance of the Shia. Also rolling up your clothes, so this would be the trousers or the sleeves, then this should not be rolled up. It is makruh to do so. Rather, the idea is to let your clothes hang. And if you have long hair, then let them come down onto the ground when you prostrate, and don't tie them behind your back, as in a ponytail. Rather, you should let the ponytail go and let the hair touch the ground. And in the chapter, we have a narration where Abdullah ibn Abbas saw Abdullah ibn al-Harith prostrating, making the sajda, and his hair was tied behind his back, meaning in a ponytail fashion. And so Ibn Abbas undone the ponytail. Then after the Salah, Abdullah ibn al-Harith asked Ibn Abbas why you did this, and Ibn Abbas replies that I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, إِنَّمَا مَثَلُ هَذَا مَثَلُ الَّذِي يُصَلِّي وَهُوَ مَكْتُوفٌ. That the likeness of this, meaning prostrating with your hair tied behind your back, is the likeness of someone who makes sajda with his hands tied behind his back. And so we find from that narration then that you change the munkar or the evil with your hands if you have the authority to do so. Normally, if you find somebody praying in this way, you would not physically undo his hair. Rather, the course of action would be to inform him of what is right and what is wrong.
It has been said that the wisdom of not tying your hair and clothes in the sajda is because in tying so it would resemble proud people, and that the whole point about the sajda is that you humiliate yourself before Allah Jalla wa Ala. So any imagery of prideness is naturally not befitting.
Hadith 246. From Anas, the Prophet says, اعتدلوا في السجود ولا يبسط أحدكم ذراعيه انبساط الكلب. The Prophet says, be upright in your sujood, and one of you should not lay his arms down on the floor just as a dog does. So here in the Salah we find it is a noble action, and if it is a noble action then we do not resemble animals. And so if you make your sajda and your forearms are laid flat on the ground and your elbows are on the ground as well, just as a dog lays down, then you are resembling a dog, and it is not fitting that in your salah, the noblest of actions, you should resemble a dog or any other animal for that matter. So we say that your arms need to be upright, your elbows are far apart from your main torso, your belly is away from your thighs, and your thighs are away from the lower leg, and your back is straight, your arms are apart, so you look nice and active in your salah, not lazy. This is what i'tidal means in your sajda, being upright. And so if you make the sajda in a slack manner, then your sajda is correct as long as you have the 7 bones on the ground, but you have done something which is makruh because you've gone against this particular order of the hadith. So your sajda is not as fully reward worthy as it could have been. Hadith 247 from Abdullah ibn Malik ibn Buhayna, he says, when the Prophet would pray, he would set apart his arms until the whiteness of his armpits could be seen. This narration is talking about the sajda position because only then we could see the armpits, and we know that a little child could pass underneath the arms of the Prophet. That's how apart they were when he was in the sajda. We can also take from this narration that the armpits are to be kept clean and the armpit hair are to be removed, because otherwise you couldn't see the whiteness of his armpits. And this is from the fitrah, which is well known of course, is that you pluck out the hair of the armpit. Hadith 248, this is the narration from Aisha radiallahu anha. She says that the Prophet would begin the salah with the takbir, and he would begin the qira'ah or the recitation with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And when he would go into ruku', he would not raise his head too much, nor would he lower it too much, but rather it would be just in the middle there. And when he would rise from the ruku', he would not go down into the prostration until he would be standing still upright. And when he would raise his head from the sajda, he would not go into the second sajda until he was sitting upright and straight. And after every 2 raka'at, he would recite the at-tahiyyah, and he would lay his left foot on the ground and erect his right foot up. And he would forbid people from the heels of the shaitan, meaning sitting down as the shaitan sits down. And he would also forbid that a man should lay his arms down on the floor in the sajda position, just as the wild animal puts his arms on the floor. And the Prophet would finish his salah with the taslim. So from this narration we learn many things about the prayer. And indeed this narration from Aisha is one of the most valuable narrations we have pertaining to the Prophet's prayer. We find you open the prayer with the takbir, and this is a rukn of the salah. You don't have a salah if you don't have the takbiratul ihram. We find here that the Prophet began the recitation with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, not with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and this is the correct opinion, that the Bismillah is to be said and recited but not out aloud. And this was the sunnah of the Prophet and Abu Bakr and Umar. As for when you're in your ruku', your back is straight, such that if water was to be put on the Prophet's back, it would not drip. That's how straight and horizontal the Prophet's back was. And the standing up position after the ruku' is also a rukn of the salah. It must be done properly with tum'anina, and so you stand up straight and you relax, you breathe a little bit, because many people just stand up maybe for half a second and then they whiz down into the sajda, and this is wrong. Rather, this standing up position must be taken seriously, and you must have tum'anina, and you must make the recitations in that standing up position. The Prophet would forbid the heels of the shaitan. There are two ways in which we could interpret this. So what's happening, that the balls of your feet are on the ground and your feet are up erected, and you are sitting, so your buttocks are on the two heels of your feet, and this is referred to as the heels of shaitan. Now the point is that we do in fact have evidence that this is permissible, and if we say that this is permissible, then we can say it is permissible in between the two sajdas, not when you're reciting the tashahhud. Otherwise, the second version is when your buttocks are on the floor and they are in between your 2 feet. So both your feet are laid on the floor, so the top of the foot is on the ground, so your feet are spread out like this, and your buttocks are in between the feet and your buttocks are on the floor. So you will not be able to hold this position for very long, because it is not a very comfortable position. Hence this is impermissible in the salah. Also, iq'a is a position which we are forbidden from, and this is exactly when you sit like a dog. You've all seen a dog, how it sits down. Its buttocks are on the floor and its legs are upright. So it's when you have your buttocks on the floor, your thighs and your lower leg are both upright, and you are supporting yourself thereby with your hands on the floor. And this is exactly how a dog sits like, so you are not allowed to do this in the prayer. And we learn that when you're in the tashahhud position, sitting down, you lay down your left foot, and that's what you sit on, and the right foot is up erected. And this is in the first tashahhud in a salah which has 2 tashahhuds. As for the last tashahhud, then we have evidence in al-Bukhari that you sit in the tawarruk position, which is that your left foot goes underneath through to the right hand side, and you sit on your left buttock, and the right foot is up erected. As for when you sit on the left foot, then this position is called the iftirash. So in a prayer of 2 tashahhuds, so that would be the 4 rak'ah or 3 rak'ah prayer, the first tashahhud you sit in the iftirash position, as Aisha mentions here, and in the last tashahhud you sit in the tawarruk position. As for the salat al-subh, which is only 1 tashahhud, then your first one is your last, so which one do you do? There is a difference of opinion here, but what appears to be the weightier opinion is that you sit in the iftirash position, and the tawarruk position is only done after the iftirash has been performed. Also, we find here that you don't lay your arms on the ground when you're in the sajda, just as a beast of prey does. And again, we spoke about the dog laying its arms on the floor. So in the sajda, your arms are upright, so your elbows are far apart, and both your feet are also up erected on the balls of your foot, of course, and your feet are joined together. This is the correct opinion. And the toes are pointing towards the qibla. Likewise, your fingers, they are together and they are pointing towards the qibla. We also learn that you end your salah with the taslim, and we say that the taslim is 2 taslims, one on the right and one on the left. This is the authentic narration which we have, and many of them for that matter, and this is the usual practice of the Prophet. So we say it must be 2 taslimatain, not just 1 taslim on the right. And this is the weightier opinion. Hadith 249, this is about the sutra. From Talha, he says that we would be praying and the animals would be passing by in front of us as we are praying. We mentioned this to the Prophet because obviously the companions would have felt some sort of discomfort with this. And to this the Prophet replied, مثل مؤخرة الرحل تكون بين يدي أحدكم ثم لا يضره ما مر بين يديه. Something like the back of a saddle should be in front of you, and then anything which passes by beyond that would not harm you. In another narration of this chapter, when the Prophet ﷺ went out for the Eid prayer, he had a spear which he took out with him to be used as a sutra. And he would also do this on his journeys. When the people in those days would ride a camel, they would be sitting on a saddle, and this saddle would have a backrest, just as you find a typical chair nowadays. And this backrest would be made of wood. It would be about 2/3 of a forearm length. And so we find this should be the minimum length of the sutra. There is a difference of opinion as to whether this sutra is wajib or mustahab. Some say wajib, some say mustahab. Those who say it is wajib, they say that the Prophet ordered it in the hadith, in the sunan, authentically, إِذَا صَلَّى أَحْدُكُمْ فَلْيَسْتَتِرْ. When one of you prays, then let him take a sutra. This is an order format. A sutra doesn't have to be an inanimate object, rather it could be an animate object. An animal could be a sutra, as long as you're sure that it won't disturb you. But we know that the regular practice of the Prophet would be that he would pray towards a sutra, and if he was on a journey, he would pray towards a spear which he would plant in the ground. So we say, for practical purposes, just take a sutra with you, and always use a sutra, whether you're in a masjid, in the house, or outside somewhere. Pray towards a sutra, be on the safe side. Because the opinion which says that it is wajib is a decent opinion, even though many scholars say it is mustahab only. However, it is there to benefit you in your prayer, because then anyone who passes beyond the sutra, it won't harm you. There'll be a screen between you and him, and it would lead to a lot more peace and tranquility in your prayer, which is for your benefit, of course. Except we know that the sutra of the imam is the sutra of the ma'mum, so every ma'mum does not need to take a sutra because the imam carries this off the ma'mum. In the same chapter, narration from Ibn Abbas, he says that the Prophet was praying in Mina, he was leading the prayer, and Ibn Abbas, he was nearing the age of puberty, he was riding a donkey, and so he rode the donkey in front of the row of the Sahaba, and then he got off and joined the prayer, and nobody rebuked him. So here we find that the ma'mum, he does not need a sutra, and anyone can pass in front of him, it would not matter. It's only when you're praying alone would you need a sutra. The difference of opinion is that if you are ma'mum and the imam finishes the prayer but you still have a rak'ah or two to make up for, then do you become a munfarid, praying on your own, or do you become a ma'mum hukman, somebody who is following the imam in terms of the ruling, not physically though? So if you become a munfarid, then you would need a sutra, but if you are still a ma'mum even after the imam's prayer, because you are continuing on from being a ma'mum from the imam, then you would not need a sutra, because you're a ma'mum hukman. So upon this there is a difference of opinion. Some would say you're a munfarid, so you need a sutra. Others would say no, you still don't need a sutra because you joined the imam when you did not need a sutra. So even now, after the imam finished the salah, you still don't need a sutra. But we say, for practical purposes, if you can move forward a little bit and move in front of a sutra, then this would be preferable without doubt. Ibn Abbas says in this narration that the Prophet was praying not facing a wall, and so because of this, the opinion forms that you don't need to pray towards a sutra, because the Prophet is not praying towards a sutra here, as Ibn Abbas says, he was not praying towards a wall. Others reply by saying, yes, he was not praying towards a wall, but what is well known is that in his journeys, he would carry a spear and he would plant the spear in front of him. So he would have been praying towards a spear. This is why we say it is better to pray towards a sutra in all cases, and just to be on the safe side. Hadith number 250 from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. He says, the Prophet said, إِذَا صَلَّى أَحَدُكُمْ إِلَى شَيْءٍ يَسْتُرُهُ مِنَ النَّاسِ فأراد أحد أن يجتاز بين يديه فليدفعه في نحره فإن أباه فليقاتله فإنما هو شيطان. When one of you is performing the salah towards a sutra and another person wants to pass by in front of him, then let him stop the passerby in front of his chest. But if he refuses and continues to try to pass by, then fight him because he is a shaitan. So we learn from this narration then that it is not permissible to pass by in front of a musalli in between him and his sutra. If the musalli does not have a sutra, then you are not allowed to pass by in between him and his place of prostration where he would place his forehead, because this place is specific to the musalli and it is his own personal space, so you're not allowed to violate it. And so the musalli has been given permission to even fight off this passerby. We could take from this hadith that you could have shayateen from the ins, because the Prophet says that this person is a shaitan. So either he is a shaitan from the ins, or it could mean that it is the shaitan who is prompting this person to continue to pass by, even though you have prevented him and even though he knows that you are praying. But it is the shaitan who is inciting him to do this to spoil your prayer. If in fighting him back you happen to kill him, then you would not need to pay the blood money, nor will there be any retaliation against you because you did what the Sharia has given you permission to do. It's much like, for example, if somebody spies on you in your own private house and you throw a stone at him and you pop his eye out, there would be no retaliation against you, nor will there be any blood money for you to pay because you did what the Sharia permits you to do. And we know from another narration that if a person who wants to pass by in front of a musalli knew the sin upon him, then for him to wait for 40 would be better than passing by. And this narration is also in the same chapter. لو يعلم المار بين يدي المصلي ماذا عليه لكان أن يقف 40 خيرا له من أن يمر بين يديه. And 40 is mentioned, but we don't know if it's 40 days, months, years, and so it is left unknown. But the point is that it is a major sin to pass by in front of the person who is praying. But this is in the case if the one who is praying, he is not transgressing the limits. So for example, if the one who is praying deliberately prays in the mataf, the place where you make the tawaf, then he is the mu'tadi, because this place is specific for those who want to make the tawaf. Now if you're praying right in the middle and causing unnecessary inconvenience, then you are the mu'tadi, you are the one transgressing the limits, and the others would be allowed to pass by in front of you. Similarly, if you pray right in the middle of the street, causing unnecessary inconvenience, then the people here are well within their rights to pass by in front of you because you are the mu'tadi in this case now. But as for if you're away from the people and just praying in a private place, there, if somebody tries to pass by in front of you, he now is the mu'tadi and you are allowed to stop him. Hadith 251 from Sahal ibn Sa'd al-Sa'idi, he says, between the Prophet and the wall in front of him, meaning the sutra in this case, there was enough space for a sheep to pass by. Yazid says that Salaah, one of the companions, always used to pray in front of a pillar which was near the Mus'haf, and so I said to him, "O Abu Muslim, I see you always seeking this place at the pillar." And he replied that I saw the Prophet always seeking to pray at this place. So we take from the narrations then that when you're praying towards a sutra, you don't have a large gap between you and the sutra. So if we take a look then, a gap just enough to make a sheep pass by is not a very large gap at all. So this goes to show that you should be quite close to the sutra you're praying in front of. And we also learn from the second narration that there's no problem in always praying in the same place, particularly if there is some virtue in that place. Hadith 252 from Abu Dharr. إذا قام أحدكم يصلي فإنه يستره إذا كان بين يديه مثل آخرة الرحل، فإذا لم يكن بين يديه مثل آخرة الرحل فإنه يقطع صلاته الحمار والمرأة والكلب الأسود. He says, when one of you prays, then if he has something like the back of a saddle in front of him, then this will cover him. If he does not have something like the back of a saddle in front of him, then a donkey, a woman, or a black dog would break his prayer. And Abu Dharr was asked, what's up with a black dog? Why not a red dog or a yellow dog? And he says, I asked the Prophet this, and the Prophet replied, Al-kalbu al-aswadu shaytan. The black dog is a shaitan. So we learn from this hadith then, that when you pray, you should have in front of you something like the back of a saddle, and this is at least 2/3 of a forearm length. So it could be anything. It could be a stick, even a chair, a spear, anything really, at least 2/3 of a forearm length. And of course, anything longer than that would be fine. It could even be another person sitting in front of you. That person could act as a sutra as well. So we need to note here that these 3 things will break your prayer if they pass by in front of you, not merely if they are just in front of you. So for example, we know the Prophet would be praying in his room and Aisha would be in front of him. So this would not break the Prophet's prayer. It is when you pass by in front. And also this applies to when you're praying either alone or when you're the Imam. As for when you're the Ma'mum, then the sutra of the Imam is your sutra. So even if a donkey or a woman or a black dog was to pass by in front of you and you're the Ma'mum, your prayer would not be broken, because the Imam carries the sutra from you. So there are 3 things. A donkey is a donkey, any sort of donkey, large, small, male, female, it doesn't matter. As for the woman, it needs to be a grown-up adult woman. A girl would not break your prayer if she passes in front of you. And as for the black dog, then the black dog breaks the prayer, whereas a white dog or a brown dog or any other colored dog would not break the prayer. And this black dog needs to be jet black, all black. So if he is mostly black or half black, let's say like a Rottweiler, which is a black dog but it has brown underneath in its chest and belly area, then this type of dog does not break the prayer. And the reason why the black dog should be a shaitan is unknown to us, and these are from the matters of the unseen. We just simply take it at face value, only because the Prophet ﷺ has said so. Now with the word qata' which is used, it means cut off. Does this mean that the reward is cut off but that your prayer is intact? Or does it mean that your prayer is cut off so that you have to begin again? Well, there's a difference of opinion here, but what's apparent from the hadith is that your prayer is cut off, because the wording is فَإِنَّهُ يَقْطَعُ صَلَاتَهُ, that his prayer is cut off. So it is upon us to go by the apparent meaning of the hadith. If a person does not have a sutra in front of him, then the place of his sutra would be where he prostrates his forehead. So anyone passing beyond that place, it doesn't break off the prayer, but anyone passing within that place, then it would harm the prayer. And if that somebody happens to be one of those 3 categories, then it would cut off the person's prayer if he is a munfarid or imam.
Now with regards to the black dog, the Prophet ﷺ forbade killing the dogs because they are a whole species. However, he did allow the killing of black dogs. So these dogs are not to be left alone, and you cannot then use them for guarding purposes and hunting purposes.
Hadith 253, the statement of Aisha, she says that she was sleeping in front of the Prophet and her feet were in the direction of the qibla of the Prophet as he was praying. When the Prophet would make the sajda, he would touch the feet of Aisha and she would withdraw them, and when he got up from the sajda, she would stretch her legs out again. And she says that there were no lights in the houses in those days. Aisha is narrating this to show that the woman does not cut off the prayer. But we agree, okay, if the woman is in front of the man, she does not cut off the prayer, but we said that it is the passing by in front of the musalli that cuts the prayer off, not merely staying still in front of the musalli. And in the same chapter, Aisha says, in response to the previous hadith, that the woman is an evil creature. So she's saying that how can this hadith be true, because then you're likening the woman to a donkey and a black dog. You're putting the woman in the same category. However, we would have to disagree with Aisha on this particular issue. The hadith is authentic and we must go by the hadith and not the statement of any companion if it contradicts the hadith. No companion, however knowledgeable he or she may be, whether it be Aisha or anyone else, could have full knowledge of the sunnah. We find also in this narration the Prophet is touching Aisha. Does this break the wudu? Well, even if we say that this is a skin-to-skin contact, it still wouldn't break the wudu, because some scholars say that this needs to be a touch with desire. A skin-to-skin touch with desire, this breaks the wudu. But the correct opinion is that even a touch with desire does not break the wudu. Rather, sexual intercourse breaks the wudu and puts you in a state of janabah. Hadith 254, from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, لا يصلي أحدكم في الثوب الواحد ليس على عاتقه منه شيء. One of you should not pray with one garment, and there is nothing of this garment on his shoulders. Most scholars say that covering the shoulders during your prayer is mustahab, because we have evidence to suggest that some companions would pray and their shoulders were uncovered. For example, the Prophet telling one of his companions that if your garment is tight, then make an izar out of it, but if it is wide and expansive, then wrap it around yourself. Well, if you make an izar out of your garment, then your shoulders will be uncovered. And so most scholars say that what is important is that from below the belly button to the knees, or just above the knees, this should be covered. The Hanbali madhab is that it's wajib to cover your shoulders if you are able to do so, and if you're able to do so and you do not cover your shoulders, then this is haram and you are worthy of punishment. And also the Prophet was asked about praying with one item of clothing, and he replied, أَوَلِكُلِّكُمْ ثَوْبَانِ, does each and every one of you have 2 items of clothing? So this goes to show that the Sahaba had a very basic living. They just had one item of clothing to wear in which they would perform the Salah.
You may pray in one item of clothing as long as you have covered the awrah. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. Give the rule on how proportionately long each phase of the Salah should be. Question number 2. When making dua, why is it a good idea to go into detail? Question number 3. What is the threat of passing in front of the one who is praying? And is it always the case that you must never pass in front of the person who is praying? Meaning, are there any exceptions?